today. On the line, we also have here with us Lauren, and you can see a picture of her beautiful face here, and she's going to be working behind the scenes, and she will be taking any of the questions that you have and letting me know. So we'll pause periodically in between if you have any questions at all. You'll also see to the right there is a chat box. You can put comments in there, and if you have any specific questions, you should see a questions tab, and what you'll do is you'll press the plus sign and then just jot down any questions that you have for me as the facilitator, and I am more than happy to answer those questions for you. So I'd like to keep my session sort of light, and I will be talking quite a bit, obviously, and we'll also be asking for you to participate in a poll question, so please do that. I do encourage participation, and I also like it when you guys ask me questions, so that lets me know, one, that you're actually paying attention, and two, we can answer the questions that are on your mind. So with that, let's get started. With change management, most of you are probably attending here because you are already working on change projects, and you'd like to know a little bit more about how can you go about and sustaining that change in your organization. Oftentimes, when change is introduced in an organization, it gains a bunch of momentum, people get all excited, and they're all inspired to take some action, and then once the project is implemented, then that momentum starts to slow down. So how do we sustain the change by keeping people still engaged? And most often we find that individuals, when they're dealing with change, because it's so inherently dynamic, their moods and their temperament also sort of sways with the change itself. So we're going to be looking at how do we go about and gaining that momentum, which is what we refer to as critical mass, so that we can get the most amount of people within the organization on board with the change so that we can sustain it once it's in post-implementation state. So with this, I'd like for you to take a look at the two different quotes on the screen right now. The one at the bottom I'd like to draw your attention to here by Andy Warhol, who says, "They always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself." So what exactly does that mean? I mean, you do a lot of work as is right now in your workplace as you're working on different change initiatives, but the reality is you actually have to take some initiative on your own to make change stick. You have to put things into practice immediately in order to make sure that it's going to be sustained in the long haul. You can't expect to come up with a really great idea, go about it, implement it, and just leave it and know that people are going to adapt that change and want to stick with it. Because the reality is they don't. They're probably looking to see how can I get, is there any loopholes, what is the easiest way that I can sort of accomplish this or move on, or is there another way that I can circumvent this change? So to make sure that it sticks, you're really looking at changing the behavior and making sure that that behavior is sustained over a long period of time. So what are we going to learn today in this webinar? So for the next hour or so, what we're going to be looking at is to identify challenges to sustain change for individuals and organization. We're going to take a look at what critical mass looks like and how do we go about and start a movement towards critical mass. And then we're going to discover the 5 key strategies to achieve critical mass and to sustain change at the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level. So what I'd like for you to do now that you know what the learning objectives are is if there are any of you that there's something in particular that you want to know specifically about sustaining change and critical mass, if you could just take a minute and jot that down into the question tab, and I'll try to do my best to weave that into today's session. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and give you guys an opportunity just to jot down anything that you would really like to take away from today's session so that you can make it worthwhile for you. Okay, so we got one here from Jordan who's asking about at what point do you leave people behind if they won't buy into the change and are obstructing your process and direction? That's a great question, Jordan, and I'll try to do my best to sort of weave that in near the end. Oh, we have another one here by Krista. How do you inspire your team to keep their focus on the new vision? Excellent. Okay, so we'll work with the two of those. So we're looking at what point do we leave people behind and how do we inspire them to keep the focus. I'll take one more if it comes in the next few seconds. Okay, great. We've got one more. Sarah. This looks from where there's a significant scope change agreed to by all stakeholders on existing projects, how to stop the old scope from creeping back in and doubling up on efforts. It's difficult to get people to understand the game has changed and they have some new pieces but have to sacrifice some of the old. So this is to deal more so when we have significant scope change, and how do you get them to, so this is more around sustainability of the behavior change so that they're not going back and reverting back to old behaviors. Okay, we will definitely get to that. Excellent. Okay, so, I see one more came in here too, or how do you deal with unethical behavior? You throw them out of the company, that's what you do. No, I'm just joking. Great question, David, and what we will do is we'll look at the unethical behavior and we'll try to weave that into today's conversation. I was just joking, by the way. You never throw people out of the company unless it's something that's so unethical that it's against the law and it requires removal of that individual from the organization because they're not acting with integrity, ethics, and being responsible. And at the end of the day, they have to be accountable for their actions. All right, so with that, let's get started. Here. So really, let's take a look at what defines change management. And here's a definition of change management from Harshak from the book Making Change Happen and Making It Stick article. And so in this definition of change management, you're really looking at engaging people in the process throughout the whole time when you are putting together your change initiative. But it really goes beyond just engaging them. You want to make sure that you're enabling them with addressing the key processes within the organization, and sometimes that might include performance management. And the point of this is to really help your individuals make that transition to the new behavior. And you want them to sustain that behavior going forward. And that's not always an easy thing for them to do because more times people just want to revert back to old behaviors, whatever is comfortable to them. So when you're looking at change management, you want to make sure that you're putting in systems in place that's going to emphasize what the new behaviors are that you're looking for, and it's also going to encourage people to want to do that because you've got procedures and support mechanisms to help sustain the new benefits that are going to be coming post implementation of the change initiative. So when we look at this in a broader context in terms of change leadership and what does that look like, change leadership really is around the leader being able to get their individuals and their staff or their team from the current state to the desired end state. And what it does is it incorporates 4 key areas. So the first one looks at the context, which is why. Why do we need to change, and what is the importance of this? And then we take a look at who is going to be involved, who are the people that are going to be impacted by the change and may also be involved in it. And then what are the processes around making this happen? And then lastly, what could be the potential barriers? So once those 4 elements are taken into consideration, then we can move individuals from the current state to the desired end state. And this is really where sustaining change sort of fits in. So I see we have a question here. So I'm going to take a look at that. How do you get sponsors to actively support the change process? Well, you want to engage the sponsors right from the beginning. And this is where you need to be able to explain to them the benefits of the change initiative, but also explain to them the consequences of not changing. Oftentimes people, they can see that, yeah, it's a really great idea, but they may feel that it's just too much effort on their behalf to sort of jump in or to be a champion for that change actively. So to engage them right from the beginning is where I would suggest to do that, because this way you're including them in the conversations, you're gaining their buy-in, and you're also increasing the odds of their commitment to the actual change initiative. At this point is where you want to make sure that they're committed and that they're engaged to be a change champion. People are always looking to leaders for support. So if they're not buying in or they're somewhat committed, the rest of the team or the organization is going to be able to see that. So they need to be able to understand what is the benefits of the desired end state. They also need to be involved in the decisions and in engaging other folks and inspiring them, but they need to see the broader perspective and the broader benefits, and it has to be benefits to them. If they just see the benefits just to the organization, which is fine, and everybody needs to see why are we doing this because it's aligned with our strategic objectives, but people also want to see what is the benefit to them individually. And if they don't understand what the benefits are to them individually, that's usually where it's difficult for them to commit. So when you're looking at getting sponsors to actively support, you may want to state it, one, in terms of benefits to them specifically, and then to their department or team, and then look at it from the organization, involving them in those discussions right from the beginning, and then asking them to be a champion for that change initiative. They also need to be clear that they are going to be taking some accountability, and that's part of the role of a change sponsor. Not only are you to help fund the change initiative, but you also have to take accountability as to the initiative going right through to post-implementation. And then you need them to be supporting the change in it when it's already implemented, so that way it sustains and it is solidified within the organization and people don't revert back to old behaviors. It's a great question. So now I'd like for us to do a bit of a change activity. And I know this sounds a little bit unconventional because you guys are all on a call and I can't see you. So I'm going to have an element of trust here. So what I'm going to ask for you to do is to please cross your arms. So just do it. I know that I can't see you, but I want you just to go along with me. Just cross your arms for a moment. Okay? So now take your arms out. Now do it the reverse way. I know some of you are kind of going like this, and you're kind of fiddling a little bit with your arms and trying to figure out how am I supposed to do that. You took a little bit of a pause. The thing is with change, when you're doing things the way that you always do it, it's so easy. So when I asked you to cross your arms the first time, it was probably simple. Some of you may have already had your arms crossed as you're listening to this webinar right now. Then when I asked you to uncross your arms and then cross them in the reverse way, you had to sort of think about it. Like, did I have my hand over? Was it under? And how am I going to do this? So it takes a bit of a moment. And when you think about change, when you ask people to do something differently, it requires for them to break an old habit. And then they have to think through the process, which is the steps that are involved to make it happen, and then they actually have to commit to the new behavior. Now, for some of you, you probably have released your arms and you're no longer doing this activity, when I haven't actually asked you to stop or to uncross your arms at any point. So you might find that kind of interesting. Some of you may even be laughing at that at this moment. The funny thing is, when you don't have a system or a structure in place to support that change, people will revert back to their old ways, or they'll stop doing it because nobody's there to watch them. So when you are putting in a new change initiative, you're asking people to change their behaviors, you have to think about what are the consequences if they don't actually sustain that behavior. Is there any consequence for not sustaining the change? And if there isn't, then why are people going to do it? What's going to prevent them from going back to the old way that they used to do something? So I've got another question here, which, let's see. Change initiatives, even though its benefits, I'm sorry, what if you have a leader who is resistant and won't commit to change initiatives even though it benefits the team and ultimate organization? So that kind of goes back to that other question that we were talking about before in terms of getting sponsors to actively support the change. So that's also a really great question there. Thanks, Denise. When you have a change leader who is resistant and they don't really want to commit to the change initiative, you have to figure out why. So this requires you to go back to them and ask some questions to figure out what is their resistant points. And oftentimes they may have been working on the old system, so they don't want to let it go. And in this case, that you're going to meet some resistance, or perhaps they've looked through the entire program and something is not resonating with them, or they have some apprehensions, whether it is with regards to the impacts on people or the impacts on the process. And if those aren't addressed clearly to their standards or to their level of comfort, it's very difficult to get them to commit. For those leaders who are working on the old system, which is the current state, and you're now asking them to stop this and we need you to move into a new system, you always have to acknowledge prior losses. And I find that that's one of those things that is often overlooked, and people don't even stop to think about it. Let's say, for instance, you were working on a project for 5 years, took you, or 3 5 years to get it developed. It got up and running. People thought it was amazing. They were using it. Now they were using it go forward for another 5 or 10 years, and everything's been going great. And you've got all these accolades. You've been told it was an awesome program. And then all of a sudden, somebody gets this great idea, and they say, you know what, based on the way that the economy is going, we need to shift direction, and we need to change. And we'd like for you to champion the new direction and the new change. But you know that you've been working and championing the old way that things have been done. Unless people acknowledge and they can say, you know what, the old way that we had answered, we were doing work then, it was effective and it worked for that time. And we appreciate all the work that you've done, and now we want to move forward to a new direction. Unless you acknowledge what that person has done in the past, it's going to be very difficult to get them to move towards the future. So you need to make sure that you're always acknowledging losses. And it's very similar to like a death. When my grandfather had passed away, people would come to me and say, oh, you know what, he lived a really full life, so you know, he's in a better place and it's time to sort of move on. And it's very difficult to move on unless you acknowledge, I'm sorry for your loss. And that's really the best way of addressing that. So same too when you're dealing with people who are very resistant, generally speaking, it has to do with the loss of something. So when you have a leader now who's resistant and they don't want to commit to the change, you have to perhaps acknowledge some of the losses for them. Maybe they're losing team members, perhaps and staff. Maybe they lose access. Maybe they're losing things that used to work really well for them, or now they have to learn a whole new system. Whatever that loss is, that needs to be acknowledged first and foremost. Then you need to address what are their resistant points. So you have to engage in a conversation with them and figure out, well, why is this a point of contention for you? Can you show us what are your ideas? What are your thoughts? And once you get that person engaged and start talking, even if they're resistant and they don't want to commit, they should at least give you some clues as to why they're resisting, which would be a point that you should be taking down to figure out if it has something to do future forward with the process or the people, and then you can address those concerns for them. And then once you get them feeling more comfortable, then they'll engage. And that's really what that is all about, making sure that you are addressing one of their issues, you're speaking into terms that are beneficial to them, and that you're acknowledging their losses. And once those things are done, then you can start to possibly move them into the commitment phase. So it's similar to like the change management curve. So you've got to be able to acknowledge, deal with the fact that they're in denial and the resistance mode, and then bring them back up to the curve into the commitment zone. And so once they've reached the commitment, this is the point where you can look at putting in those measures for sustainability. And when you're at that point, that's where you can start to really engage them and making sure that they're not only committed, but they're championing it for other people too. So if we go back to the accountability measures now, you're looking at how do we stop people from using the old system and doing things the old way and get them to move into the new system and the new way of doing things. So this is really where you're looking at processes and policies and procedures, and you're trying to make sure that they're in alignment with the new change initiative. And if they're not, so let's say for instance, you've got a performance management system that is still rewarding old behavior. So if you would like to move into a more team-like environment where you're trying to encourage the behavior of teamwork, collaboration, but yet you're still rewarding people for individual performance and you're encouraging them to be go-getters and overachievers on their own, then you're not really rewarding the behavior that you're trying to seek, which is the teamwork and collaboration. So you really have to take a look at all of the systems as a whole to ensure that they're in alignment with the change initiative that you're trying to bring in. So things like performance review, progress reports, metrics, status reports, town halls, all those are going to be ways that you can gain that information and reinforce the need for the change. And when you see the public support from your senior management, if you're in a hierarchical type organization, that's really great, because then when senior management is front and forward and they're supporting the change, others will also too get engaged with the change and they'll see that it's very important. For organizations that tend to be more organism-based, where people sort of value power and knowledge, then perhaps getting people that are like your specialists or consultants to come in and they're speaking about the benefits and they're showing ways to sustain the change, they're putting in frequent communications. We are looking at the processes and the procedures and perhaps additional policies, and they're being the ones that are championing it. That might also be a strategy that you might want to look into in terms of making people accountable and encouraging that communication and that dialogue. Making individuals accountable for their own action and behavior is also a really good strategy to use, and that also helps to increase the sustainability at the end. So the performance reviews is also a really great way to tie individual objectives to the organizational strategic objectives. And by doing that, you're sort of putting it in a strategic perspective where everybody's working together towards the same goal. Okay, so now I'd like for us to do a polling question here. And Lauren's going to get that up. I would like for you to think about change initiatives that you've had in your organization and businesses, and how many of those, or what percentage of those, do you think actually failed? So you have, the poll is now open, so I'd like for you to start answering that. What percentage do you think actually fail? Perfect. I can see where people are going with this. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in about 5 more seconds. Perfect. Okay, so now if we can view the poll, we'll see the poll results. So you can see here that most of you thought that 55% of 55% of change initiatives actually fail. So what you might be surprised is that when we look at John Cotter, and he's like the guru of change management, and he did substantial research with regards to change initiatives and the success of them, and what you'll find, we go back to this, is that 70% of change initiatives in organizations actually fail. That's huge if you think about that. That means only 30% of the projects that we work on are actually successful. And the key criteria to that, or the critical factor, is the sustainability. Oftentimes when people put together a change initiative, they can get it up and running, they can execute it really well, they get it implemented, but they just don't get it to sustain. And so the sustainability is that key factor which, or criteria, which will constitute success of a project. So 70% of the projects that we do right now actually fail, and only 30% of them are successful. So those are staggering numbers. So if you happen to be part of that group that has really good change projects that actually work, and you're now in the implementation phase and you've been successful, and it's post-implementation and it's still successful, congratulate yourselves, because you're part of that small percentage of the change initiatives that have actually worked. So what is the key to making change stick? Well, it's really about making the new behaviors become an intrinsic part of your everyday life and work in your organization. And if you don't have that, then what people will do is sort of revert back to their old ways. So if you remember that activity that I asked you to do with to cross your arms and then uncross them and put them the other way, it's really around the sustainability of it, because most of you kind of stop crossing your arms and just, or maybe you didn't even do the activity. But what you will notice is that people, if there's nothing in place, no systems, no structures or policies in place to make sure that behavior sticks, people will just go back to their old ways of doing things. So we got to really take a look at how do we get that to stick. How do we get people to want to try the new behaviors, and then how do we get them to sustain those new behaviors going forward? So there's a couple of obstacles first that get in the way of change success. So we're going to take a look at 7 of these, and these are extracted from a ProSize 2009 benchmarking report. So the first one here talks about ineffective change sponsorship from senior leaders. And a few of them have, a few of you guys have sent in some questions with regards to getting senior leaders and your change sponsor to actually commit to the change. If you don't have their commitment, the project is almost, steps behind then, and it will likely not succeed if you don't have a really good change sponsor or you don't have senior leaders supporting the change. So at this point, I would say right at the very beginning is make sure that you secure a really good change sponsor, somebody who's visible in the organization that people respect, And also get the support from senior leaders. You need their buy-in and commitment from the beginning, because without them, it's very difficult for the rest of the organization to jump on board or to commit, because they are always looking for to see what senior management is doing. There was a report that was done through a benchmarking report that was done in 2007, actually, where it was talking about the impact that managers have and leaders have on their employees. And up to 26% of the behaviors of the employees are actually impacted by the behaviors of your manager or your supervisor or your leader. So if you as a leader are not supporting the change, it's very likely that your followers or your direct reports are not going to support the change as well. The second point here that causes a lot of obstacles or hindrance towards change management success is the resistance to change from employees. And that could be for a whole host of reasons. When I talked about before, acknowledgement of losses is key to this, and making sure that you understand where is the employee at. When change is introduced, although some employees might think this is a fantastic idea, I'm all about the opportunities with change, others are going to be resistant because they're losing something. So you need to be able to explain it to them in terms that make sense to them. What are the benefits of the change to them? What is going to change for them, and what is going to stay the same for them? And unless you're able to answer those questions, it's very difficult to remove that resistance. So you need to acknowledge their losses, allow them to vent, allow them to go through the motions, but then show them the benefits and then explain to them how we can change together. So you need to make sure that you have the how-to in terms of the process and what's the impact going to be on the people explained to people. So otherwise they won't jump on the bandwagon for change. And know too that depending on the personality style of the individuals, some people are going to be more resistant than others. Some individuals are going to jump on the change, and others need a little bit more time and process. They need to understand the vision, they need to understand the why, and once they understand it and they see that the processes have been really thought through and that they understand the impact on the people, then they can commit. The third obstacle is insufficient change management resources and funding, and that's pretty self-explanatory. If you don't have enough money for the project to complete, it's going to be difficult for the project to be successful. When you've got resistance from middle management, so those are the people who directly influence and impact the frontline staff, they will impact their decision whether or not to be committed to the change. So it's really important for the middle management to, one, acknowledge that if they have any resistance to the change, not to deny their feelings, but to acknowledge them, and then get the answers to those questions that may be plaguing them and stopping them from committing the change. When you have poor project management, so that's more on the poor planning of a change project, that will definitely hinder the success of a project. So that requires for you to really sit there and plan through what are all of the risks, what are the implications on the scope, the time, the quality of the project, and the schedule. And when you're putting together your project plan, note that any actions that you take or any changes to the actions will have impacts on the other key knowledge areas. So when you're coming up with your project plans, you want to make sure that you're taking into consideration what are some of the potential risks that could go wrong, and then what are additional actions that we need to take in updating the schedule with those work packages or those activities in order to make sure that the project is going to be successful. So number 6, which is an ineffective communications, this one is huge. Oftentimes people will communicate that there's a change, and they figure if I communicate it once, maybe twice, everybody should know what it is and they'll be on board. The reality is, if you don't explain to people at least 7 to 15 times using different media, they will not understand what the change is. They won't understand what's involved, and it's very difficult for them to commit. So you have to have frequent communications and use different avenues to get people engaged and explain to them what the change is, why they're changing, and what's the impact going to be on to them. And the last one is the culture. If the culture that you are working in is resistant to change, it's very difficult to bring in change initiatives because people don't want to change. They like the way that things are. The reality is change is constant. So regardless of the organization you are in, you're constantly going to have to deal with change. So you have to figure out ways to incorporate that into your everyday lives and to be able to deal with your major changes on a bigger scale by having it thought through and planned through really well and having really good supporters of change, whether it be your frontline managers, your middle managers, or even the senior leaders and your key change sponsors. The change levels are threefold. So you've got change that goes on from the individual level, which is how it impacts you. Then you've got the change dynamics in terms of the team and how the individual now when they're working with a group of people, sometimes their reactions will change and the dynamics of the team is also going to change when a new initiative is introduced. And then you've got change on an organizational level when you're looking at achieving the strategic objectives. So whenever you introduce a change, think of it like a pond. When you drop a pebble into a pond, that also has a ripple effect. It's going to start off with that individual feeling, what is this change about? How's this impacting me? How do I deal with this from the team perspective? And then what does that mean in terms of the broader implications onto the organization? So now that you have a better understanding of the system changes and how when one change is introduced, it's not just about that particular individual or team because it does have other impacts on the organization as a whole. Now we're going to take a look at what are some of the strategies that are involved in sustaining those changes going forward. If you were to take our full course that we offer on sustaining change, we cover off all 5 of these essential strategies for sustaining change in your organization. But for today, what we really want to focus on is number 4. How do we go about achieving critical mass within the organization so that you're gaining that momentum, you're gaining people in their motivation and wanting them to take action to make that change happening. The other 4 strategies are also equally important, but for today we're going to focus more so on the critical mass. So you want to, as I had spoke to you before when we did the change activity, you want to make sure that you have reinforcement systems in place. You want to make sure you have really good leadership, the key sponsors and senior management, and that the team is on board. You want to be able to respond to individual reactions to change, as well as the procedural and structural elements in the organization. And then you want to make sure that you embed that change into the overall culture. But then how do you go about to achieve critical mass? So how do you get the most amount of people in the organization to commit to that change and jump on board? So this is what we're going to focus on right now. Momentum, if you look at physics, is really about mass in motion. So it's really taking a look at the velocity, the speed at which change is introduced, and mass, which is the depth and the breadth of the actual change initiative. So when you multiply those two together, you've got this momentum, which is mass in motion. Momentum is really critical to change success. If you don't have that momentum being built, it's very difficult to get people engaged and motivated and inspired to want to change. So to do that, a leader has to develop a very intentional strategy. And that strategy should include frequent communications of what the vision is. If people don't know what they're supposed to do or what the end result's going to look like, it's hard for them to get excited about that. So for them to envision what the future is going to be, you have to paint a really great picture for them, and they want to get a picture that's going to be exciting. Otherwise, people are going to be moved to take action. You need to inspire others to want to take the action by communicating that vision in terms of what the benefits are to them. Then they also need to recognize the need to deliver the results. How does this impact the organization? How does this impact the team? And how is this going to impact them? And then lastly, you want to engage the commitment by those who are going to be impacted by the change. So how do you engage their commitment? So that's really the key, because if you're not able to engage or get the commitment from those that are being impacted by the change, then it's very difficult for them to jump on board. So that goes back to acknowledging the losses and stating things and benefits that are to them, not to you. That's going to make others, it's going to make their life easier, it's going to make their job easier, it's going to make systems or processes to be completed easier, whatever that might be, and then the alignment to the organizational strategic objectives. When we're looking at sustaining change, you know, the Malcolm Gladwell had put together this really great book around the tipping point. And in here, he discusses critical mass. And critical mass occurs when you've got people and systems that are all operating together in a new way that when they're doing this, it actually achieves unstoppable momentum. So basically, they have a great synergy that's going on. So you've got people who are engaged, who are inspired and motivated to take action. You've got systems in place and procedures and policies all aligned with the change. And when all of these things are working in alignment, this is when you've got this unstoppable momentum. And that's where you've got more people who want to jump on board. And the fundamentals to this is really looking at changing people's beliefs and their behavior. And you can only create that when you've got a community that's built around that. So how do you create that community of the new beliefs and the new practices so that you can nurture that going forward? So this is really what critical mass is about. Before you could do that, you've got to take a look at the 3 major points within achieving critical mass. To develop it, you've got to look at mobilization, implementation, and then solidification. So at these 3 key areas, you start off with, you've got to be able to address them so that you can achieve that critical mass, which is almost like that tipping point or the turning point. So we start off with mobilization, and this is where you state what the vision of the change is, you get people excited, you're telling them that we're no longer going to be using the old system and why we're not using the old system. There has to be some consequence to it, because if people don't see why we can't do things the way that we're doing them right now, then they don't believe that there's a real need for change. So that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to mobilize them to take action. Then we move into the implementation phase. So this is where we start getting rid of the old system and moving into the new system. At this point, you've got the old system and the new system basically sort of competing with each other for a bit until the new system or the desired end state wins out. And when it starts to win out, this is where you've got that critical mass. So this is where most of the people have jumped on board, and this is where you've got that turning point. But in order for you to achieve that, you've got to build that momentum. Once we finish the implementation point and we move into solidification, this is where you've got to look at what are all the things that we need to do to sustain the change. Whether it's communication, we're looking at the procedures, we're looking at policies, we're looking at individual behaviors, we're looking at rewarding the positive behaviors, engaging people to be more creative, more innovative, and we're encouraging people to sort of step out of the box and embrace the new desired end state. All of this is involved in this solidification process. And without that, and without having really good change champions to keep that momentum alive, the change will die. So we've got our mobilization, which is the old state, moving into the implementation of the new state, and then solidifying that in the last phase. So this is really how you go about developing that critical mass. It's all about engaging people and making sure that they're not on their own. Now, I would like for us to show I actually really want to show us a video, which is a TED Talk by Derek Silver, and he talks about how to start a movement. For purposes of this webinar, we're not actually going to stream it because sometimes it gets a little bit choppy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to review what he talks about in terms of how to start a movement, and I will show you a couple of screenshots so you can get an idea of what he was talking about. So I'm going to give you an overview of the TED Talk, which is around how to start a movement. And really at TED, they talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So I'm going to describe to you how a movement happens from start to finish, and we're going to try to do this in under 3 minutes according to the video, and dissect a couple of key learning points from this video. So first, as most of you already know, a leader needs to have the guts to be able to stand out and be ridiculed. But it's not always so easy to follow. Here you're going to see a picture where you've got the first person who's just sort of their own follower, so to speak, and this is a very crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. So the leader, in this case, looks for a second person to come up, so now he's got a follower here, and he's going to embrace this person as his equal. So now it's not only about the follower just dancing all by themselves, it's about them as a group. It's a plural. And so the follower, at this point, you'll see his hand is kind of up there in the air. What he's doing is he's calling out for his friends to also come and join so that they all can be dancing together. And what people don't notice is that the follower is really actually very understated when it comes to attaining the critical mass. The follower has to have the guts to stand out like that. And it's really the first follower that causes the transformation of that one lone leader being considered a lone nut. Without that follower, that one person that's dancing by themselves is really just a crazy person. So here now you see another person sort of jumping in, the guy there in wearing the black shirt, and he's the second follower. So now it's not just this one crazy guy dancing, and it's not just two nuts dancing. You've got three people, and what they, you know the saying, three is a crowd. So a crowd is news. A movement has to be public, and it's important to show not just to the leader but to the other followers, because the followers emulate what other followers do, not what the leader does. So that's a key point there. Followers will emulate what other followers do, not what the leader does specifically. So here we've got two more people jumping in, and then we've got another three more people jumping in, and so at this point we've got momentum. This is what we term as the tipping point, because now we've actually got some movement going on. You'll notice that as more people start to join in, and you can see that the lady, they're sort of running in there, that it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence previously now have no reason not to jump in, so that because they're not going to stand out anymore, they're not going to be ridiculed, but they're actually going to be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So the same thing like when you're in an organization. If you've got those people, they'll start to jump in once others took the courage to sort of jump out first. So within another minute or so, if we would watch this video, you'll see that more people will start jumping in, and those that prefer to be part of the crowd will continue to jump in, and those that were sort of sitting on the fence or on the sidelines, there's really no reason for them to continue to do that, because there's no ridicule for them. Actually, they will be ridiculed if they stand on the outside. So that's a funny thing when you have a critical mass. Once enough people have jumped in, if you don't jump in too, you're considered not part of the in crowd. So that's where critical mass really has its strength, and it's able to pull more people towards that movement. So I want to recap a couple of the key lessons from this. Like the shirtless first guy who was dancing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers. You have to treat them as equals in order to make a movement, because it's not really about you. It's about the movement itself. And one of the biggest lessons here that you may have missed is that leadership is over-glorified. It's not really about the leader. It's really about the follower. And that's really the biggest lesson that you can take from this. Although the first guy was, the shirtless guy was the first guy to start the whole dancing movement, and he's going to get all the credit at the end of the day, but really it's about that first follower that transformed that first lone dancer, that first lone nut, into becoming a leader. So we're told that as leaders that we need followers to be effective, but it's really all about that first follower that really changes you from being that person that's all out on your own or being that crazy nut to really becoming a leader. You also need to have the courage to follow others. So if you are a follower at work, you need to make sure that you take that courage to jump up and stand behind that leader and show other followers how to follow. And the really great thing about that is once you start following, other people will start following too. And if you can get a few key people in the organization to commit who are looked at as those individuals that are really strong and well respected, other people will also soon follow. And then what you'll have is a momentum, and you'll have a movement, and you'll start to achieve that critical mass. So this is where you've got a whole group of people now all jumping in, and they're all dancing and having a really great time. So this is how you go about starting a movement. So if you want, you can always Google Derek Silvers, and you'll see that video on how to start a movement. It's a great 3-minute video. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. What are the signs that a tipping point is being reached during times of change? So I'd like for you to answer that question if you can. You got to put it in the chat box. Just throw out a couple of things. What are a couple of signs, if you look at your own organizations, that the tipping point has been reached when you're going through some change? So I want you to think about your organization when you know a new change has been initiated. Could have been a little bit slow, but then at what point, what were some of the things that happened that made people really think, hey, you know what, we're at a tipping point? We've got some increased enthusiasm. Yep, I see that. Absolutely. Resistance is notably decreased. That's correct. Improved morale. Yes, you will definitely see improved morale because people will be happier to come to work. We've got the changes accepted behavior, and people notice these who don't follow, and that's key. So it's the people who are the outliers who now feel like you can notice who they are, whereas before when the change was introduced, most people were the one or still waiting, sitting on the fence. Should I jump on? Should I not? You start seeing the materialize the benefits of the change, positive feedback, less questions. You'll also notice that there'll be less complaining, because usually people will complain at the very beginning whenever you have an issue with change, because people don't want to change. There's a lot of moaning and groaning, and then after things start moving, you'll hear less questions, less complaining, less feedback, or if you do get feedback, it's usually positive feedback. Excellent. Thank you guys very much for jumping in there. So my next question to you is, when you're looking at your own organizations, what have you personally done to achieve critical mass with your change initiatives? So I'd like to hear from a few of you to see what have you done to achieve some critical mass within your organizations. And it could be something as simple as just gaining key support people. But I'd like to hear what you have to say. Okay, so I've seen enlisting influential staff. Yes, that is a good one, and you're going to see that show up when we start talking about the 5 key strategies for accelerating change. We've got first, okay, it's going kind of faster. So first we need to, cast a vision. That's clear and engaging, absolutely. Looking for champions and influencers. Yes, that is very key. Integrating key personnel into the process and champion the change. You have to do that and making sure that you're amassing that huge network and getting the right people in the right positions so that they can champion the change. We've got large champion network across the organization, internal trainers. Yep, they can do a really great job in terms of communicating what the vision is, what needs to be done, and letting people know how to embrace the new change, rewarding the positive behavior and those who are following, volunteering time towards the effort. You know what, that's really key too, because as a leader, people will look at what you do, even though they look at other followers, because they're looking at the followers in terms of, should I do it because everybody else is doing it, but they're also looking at the behavior of the leaders. And if you're taking your own time to do that, that demonstrates that you have commitment to the change, and it increases the likelihood that they'll commit. We've got show small successes early on. That's right, and you want to reward those small successes and acknowledge them publicly. Discuss friction in a small group, and I would encourage that too. If there is any issues or people have concerns, if you can pull them together in small teams and discuss them openly and be transparent about it, it increases your believability and your trust as a leader. And Patrick Lencioni wrote this book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and the first one he talks about is trust. Without trust, you have nothing. So if you want a highly productive team to be able to deal with the changes, you need to be able to build that trust. So talking openly and transparently is a very good strategy in order to break down some of those barriers and get people committed to the change, because then you can also discuss solutions for the possible hindrances or obstacles that may get in the way for that change to be successful. So be knowledgeable and competent to gather lots of information. That's good. And what else do we have? Observe how leaders behave and provide feedback if they don't walk the talk. Very good. So we're basically calling out our leaders now for not following the change that they are institutionalizing or asking people to do. We also want to acknowledge the leaders that are changing and that they are demonstrating the behaviors that they're requiring and they're asking for, because that too will also encourage others to follow and walk the talk like the leaders do. Thank you all so much for your responses, and they're all correct when it comes to the achieving critical mass and change initiatives. You want to engage people. You want to be forthright with your information and do your research and ask the questions and really take the time to be transparent. If your group has some issues when it comes to the change, talk about it openly. And once they can see that you're being open, you're being transparent, you're being honest, they too will jump on board, especially if you're able to problem solve together and collectively to come up with ways of addressing some of those obstacles. So thanks, guys. So let's take a look at the 5 strategies to accelerate change to critical mass. So these came from Christopher Meyer from the Frontier of Change, and he talks about these 5 strategies to accelerate that critical mass. So number 1, you want to bring the future forward. So what that looks like is let them know what are the benefits of the change in the now. If you can't talk about the now, it's very difficult for people to be able to understand what's going on for them future forward, because they're still sort of in the today current space as opposed to 10 years or 5 years out. By acknowledging small wins, it's easier for them to understand and see the momentum being built, and then they can continue with that behavior going forward. Number 2, which talks about limiting the scope, this is where you want to get early support. You don't want people to be looking over where the grass is greener. You want them to really put a stakehold or foothold into where we are right now, and just showing them this is the desired end state, this is where we currently are, and giving them very good actionable steps to get things done. When they can take actionable steps, the more steps that they take, the more the momentum starts to build. So limiting their scope, so not looking at this, yes, it's great to know the grand vision, but when it's too big and it feels almost overpowering, people start to lose momentum because they feel that they can't achieve it. When you break it down into small actionable steps for them, then the scope is limited, then it's easier for them to be able to take those steps and then move forward. The third one talks about recruiting and expanding change ownership. So this is where you're looking at creating momentum by engaging some of what they call the wired leaders. So your wired leaders, they have to meet a certain level of criteria. They've got to be players in the organization. It's not about the ones that have the titles or positions as a senior leader. It could just be somebody who's very well respected. They have to be someone who's very trusted, that they've got a lot of personal relationships with the multiple people within the organization and even people who are outside of the organization, so they've got a really good network base. And then they are leaders with a good sense of political savvy, so they understand the politics within the organization. And then lastly, they got to have a certain level of humility. So they're humble, but yet they're outgoing leaders. They are grounded and they're pragmatic, but yet they're still inspiring and they still engage people. They encourage conflict, but they do it in such a way that it is very supportive. It encourages healthy dialogue and discussion, and it allows people to be open about what they're thinking and feeling. They can discuss different points of view and then move together towards a solution that's going to work for the masses. Number 4, which talks about compel and network growth. This is where you're looking at shifting people and moving them towards being more independent or interdependent, so that they have some autonomy to make some changes and to be creative, and you want to encourage that, but at the same time they're still working towards the end results of the end vision. And then lastly, you want to accelerate the pace, and this is so that those that are moving really slow and they're kind of dragging their feet, they feel that pressure to start moving a bit faster. So once you can see things happening, you're acknowledging all of these wins, and there's some movement towards the end result. And when people see that happen more frequently, they also feel a slight pressure to start moving with that speed, and it'll get them to start moving faster towards your end result. So these are really the 5 key strategies that you would use in terms of accelerating change for the critical masses. So there's 3 things that I want you to remember, or sort of takeaways from today's session. 1, when you are introducing change within your organization and you've got things sort of moving in that implementation stage, make sure that you acknowledge the successes and that you deal with the challenges that come along the way. Be transparent when you're having those conversations in their small groups, if need be, or at your town halls. Make sure that you address what people's concerns are so that you can remove or at least reduce resistance. Engage in excitement and tell them and show them what the future is going to look like. Paint a picture for them that seems exciting and motivating, and that way you can continue to integrate your efforts throughout the whole process. Number 2, consider the individual level, the team, and the organizational needs when you're sustaining the change. Individuals will need you to deal with their emotional reactions to change and be able to address those on an individual level. Some will be all happy about the change, while others will feel a sense of loss, and you need to acknowledge that. For the team, you need to work together with them in terms of coming up with solutions and showing them step by step the actions that they need to take. And then how does that integrate in terms of the organization's needs to sustain that change going forward, and what are the benefits that the organization is going to get. And then number 3, you can't have a lasting change without having employee involvement. Employees are really the heart of all changes. So without them, you will have nothing. So make sure you're engaging them in your conversations, you're talking openly, and that you're asking them how they feel about the change along the way, you're addressing their concerns, and that you're encouraging them to be innovative and to jump on board with the change and to make things more easier going forward. And by aligning your policies and your procedures and structures with the change, you also encourage that behavior, and it will more than likely be sustained going forward. So last couple of things. For strategic change initiatives to work, you've got to involve people at all different levels, whether it is frontline staff, your management, or senior management. And you definitely need your senior management support and the key sponsors and stakeholders to be there, and they need to be foremost, because without them, people will know that that change really isn't what the organization, where the organization is going to go, because you don't have the support of the senior leaders. So make sure that they're on board first, and that they're being there to champion the change. Individual needs are being met because you're addressing what their concerns are, and as a team that you're all working collaboratively together to make the change happen, and that you're working to sustain that change by keeping everybody accountable to that new behavior change. So at the end here, change is kind of like this. You know, at the beginning, you first start off with change, and it's just to keep you kind of awake, but then after a while, it becomes the whole way in your course of living and behavior. So it's not something that it's just a one-off. It's something that's to be integrated within the whole way that you operate and behave at work. So hopefully throughout today's session, you've learned a couple of tips in terms of how do you go about an amassing change within your organization. And if you have any questions, I would ask for you to please pose them for me now in the chat box before we wrap up. So I'm going to pause for a minute and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, well, if you do have any questions at a later point in time, please feel free to email me at siobhan.brown@titleshift.ca. I would also encourage you to go and take a look at our website for other courses that we have with regards to change management and sustaining change. We will be having an open program for those of you who would really like to delve deeper in terms of change and become a change management practitioner. So we will be having an open enrollment for those in January. And if you're interested, please go onto our website and log on and register for that. It's a really great new change program that's going to show you how you can lead change from and acknowledge the individual change level, the team change dynamics, as well as the organizational level, and really takes a deeper dive look in terms of the major changes that occur in organizations, from restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, IT-based changes, and cultural changes. And what are the strategies that you need in order to get the change up and running, get people motivated and inspired about the change, moving them throughout the entire change process, and then sustaining it at the end. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation and your time, and have a great, wonderful afternoon.